They thought it was just another injured animal call, until a single, trembling fox cub crawled into their hands and everything they knew about rescue work, family, and forgiveness unraveled. What started as a routine save would force one rescuer to confront a past shed buried and flip a small town upside down. Maya drove the rescue truck like a woman steering against memory. Her headlights cut a white path through reeds and fog as dusk folded itself over the marsh. The radio in the cab murmured routine chatter, coordinates, ETA, a volunteer's tired voice, but the air outside smelled different tonight. Wet earth, old leaves, the iron tang that comes when the world cools and animals stir. She hadn't slept properly in months, a steady insomnia that sat on her chest like a stone since she lost someone she loved. It made every emergency feel like a test, every small body in need a mirror. The call had been short. Little one under the dead willow by the boardwalk, someone heard whining. That kind of report usually meant raccoons or fledgling birds, things you could triage, treat, release. But Maya had learned to answer every call like it might be the one that changes everything. She moved through the marsh on narrow boardwalks, boots slapping the planks, breath steaming in the cooling air. Her flashlight beam skimmed over cattails and the glossy backs of waterfowl, then stopped on the knot of a dead willow, its branches hanging like fingers over the mud. There, in the shallow shadow, was the cub. It was smaller than she expected, a tangle of mud and damp fur with ears too big for its head and eyes that reflected her light back like tiny glass beads. It made no sound at first, only a slow, relentless shiver, as if every part of it were deciding whether to trust warmth. Maya crouched, the board creaking, and the smell hit her, wet fur, the cold sweetness of animal breath, the soup of marsh and decay. The cub crawled forward like an order, not so much toward her as following a need. When it reached her gloved hand, it curled around her finger with a strength that surprised her. It weighed no more than a paperback book, but its grip felt like a promise. Her hands, rough from years of work, were steady. She had moved corpses of nests and untangled fishing line and soothed birds whose wings had been clipped by cars. But tonight another layer of feeling rode those old reflexes. The cub's tiny heart fluttered against her palm like the nervous wingbeat of a trapped moth, and a memory, not a picture but a shape, surfaced, small, warm, a hand finding hers in the dark. Maya imagined for a moment that the cub's breath smelled of that lost warmth, and the edge between past and present thinned until she could almost step through. Signs of abandonment were obvious. The area around the willow was churned as if a frantic digging had been interrupted. Tufts of down and the faint scent of milk lingered in the reeds. No adult fox answered the cub's quiet whistle when Maya called out. She scanned the bank and the shallow channels beyond, eyes searching the dark for movement. An owl called once, distant and dispassionate, a sound that set a low chord of urgency in the back of her neck. Night predators were efficient here. A lone cub could not last long without the wary, invisible protection of its mother. Maya's radio crackled, and a voice reported that volunteers were en route, but she knew the first minutes would be everything. She wrapped the cub in her scarf, careful not to startle it, and felt the tremor in its frame settle as warmth spread. She cupped the tiny body against her coat and stood, listening. The marsh made a million small sounds. Frogs like distant drums, the whisper of reeds, the soft slap of water against roots. But no distinctive answering yip, no rustle that would indicate a den, only the empty, expectant hush of a place waiting for the next event. As she moved along the boardwalk, the cub tucked against her chest, Maya's mind set into work mode. Scan for den, note scent markers, call and wait, leave the area once located so a mother could return. That method had saved hundreds of young animals. Tonight there was an extra urgency. The temperature was dropping and the moon would not rise for hours. Predators that worked by scent and stealth, coyotes, owls, raccoons, would have the advantage. The marsh itself felt like a clock, its ticks measured in breaths and wing beats. She followed faint paw prints in the mud where the cub had crawled, smaller than anything she'd seen before. The prints threaded between reeds and behind a collapsed section of boardwalk, then stopped abruptly. Something had tried to drag the cub back toward a thicker clump of willow and then abandoned the attempt. Maya crouched and drew in a slow breath, tasting the air like another tool. There was a faint mineral note, wet clay, and an undercurrent of something she couldn't name, an animal musk that wasn't fox but suggested disturbance, movement. It was the kind of detail you learned to read when you spent nights listening to the lives of wild things. The cub whined when a fox call echoed from the far side of the marsh, a stuttering sound that might have been a reply or a loner's lonely cry. Maya answered softly, letting her voice hold no threat. She left a small trail of her scarf sent away from the willow and into a stand of reeds, a technique that could lead a mother back to her young by following familiar cues rather than the chaotic smells of human hands. Then she waited, feeling the marsh breathe around her, waiting stretched time into a thin, sharp wire. Maya's thoughts began to wander into the forbidden spaces she kept locked. How the nights since the loss had been longer than they used to be, filled with the replaying of small, meaningless moments that suddenly felt like confessions. She had been a rescuer for years because animals did not ask you to fix the past, they only needed someone to show up. But this cub, pressed to her chest and tasting of earth, seemed to ask more. It wanted a rescuer who could also forgive, who could believe in new families and second chances. The idea felt both ridiculous and necessary, like the sensation of finding a life preserver on a shore you had convinced yourself you had crossed. Someone called her name behind her, a low, careful voice from the darkness, and the beam of a flashlight found another volunteer pushing through the reeds, boots making slow, cautious prints. "We've got your back," the woman said, reaching to take the cub. Maya hesitated a fraction before handing it over, not wanting to relinquish the small heat against her ribs. The volunteer cradled it and checked the cub's limbs, its mouth, the set of its ears, like a clinician with a patient. "No obvious injury," she said, voice clipped with relief, "but it's too young to be alone at night. We find the den or we bring it in." Maya's mouth was dry. The plan felt simple in the way plans feel on the surface: search for den, leave the area, wait in a safe place, but the marsh had a habit of complicating simple things. She pointed to a narrow channel that cut between two stands of reeds, a dark seam where foxes might move unseen. "Follow that," she told the volunteer. "They'll take that to avoid open water." The volunteer nodded and sloshed off into the reeds, flashlight bobbing. Maya did not move with them. She stayed on the boardwalk, feeling the night press close. The cub's small whimpers had stopped, replaced by a quiet breathing that mapped itself onto her pulse. The owl called again, closer now, a single, probing note that sounded like a question. Memory and present folded together. There was the image of a willow, the impression of a small hand, the weight of waiting, and she realized she had come to this marsh tonight for reasons she could not fully articulate. Rescue work had always been about saving animals. Tonight, for reasons she didn't want to admit aloud, it was about finding something she thought she had lost. The volunteer's light cut through the reeds and then disappeared. Silence reclaimed the marsh, full and expectant. Maya took one more breath of the cool, briny air and followed. They began to measure time in small rituals: the clink of the syringe, the careful wipe of antiseptic, the soft click of Ember's crate latch at night. Each day the cub's ribs rounded, her eyes brightened, and the ways she refused to settle deepened into something that felt less like a quirk and more like a pull. Ember would eat, tumble, and then move toward the window as if magnetized. She pressed her tiny muzzle to the pane and watched the lane until the sky drained of color. If anyone opened the window to let in air, she would sniff, whine, and paw the sill until hands gently carried her back into the clinic's dim warmth. Maya watched this with a steady, growing unease. There were rules in wildlife rescue: timelines for rehabilitation, paper trails for releases, grant conditions that tangled compassion with bureaucracy. The county inspector had given them 12 weeks to prepare Ember for release or lose the small municipal funding that kept the makeshift clinic afloat. 12 weeks became a clock that ticked louder in the back of everyone's minds. The team debated: release to the nearest suitable habitat and hope Ember adapted, or follow whatever the animal's obsession wanted them to follow and risk losing the funding that saved other lives. Jonah, the team's volunteer mechanic and the one who'd driven the rusted van that first carried Ember, argued for release. "We can't keep her here forever. Wildlife's about giving them back," he said. He was pragmatic, a man used to fixing engines, not mysteries. Priya, who handled intake paperwork and had a soft way with scared animals, flinched at the thought of setting Ember loose while she scratched and whined at the window. "But what if she won't survive out there? She keeps seeking something," she said. Sam, the youngest, had a habit of bringing in old books and a warm, eager faith that there was always more to learn. "Maybe Ember's trying to tell us something," he offered, more hopeful than he was sure. Ember's fixation on the faded blue jacket was the strangest thing. The jacket sat on a hook by the clinic door, donated by a neighbor who said it might help the cub stay calm. The smell, they hoped, would be a comfort. But the jacket, old cotton, worn at the sleeve, the color gone to a whisper, seemed to have the opposite effect. Ember would lunge toward it, then whine and circle, then return to the window and stare down the lane. If anyone brushed the jacket off the hook and held it, Ember would bury her face into it and stay there, trembling with a longing that looked exactly like recognition. They began to ask questions anyone running a humane project had to ask. Where did the jacket come from? Who had worn it? It was a small thing that often opened doors larger than itself. The donor was an older woman named Rosa who lived 2 houses down the lane. She had known the blue jacket for years. She said it belonged to a man who had been living in the old stone house at the bend, the house with the boarded windows and the wild rose brambles. People in the neighborhood rarely spoke his name aloud. When they did, it came out like a rumor. Calder, someone would whisper. Old Calder who kept foxes, whispers layered on whispers. Calder had been a recluse, the kind of man who lived in the margins of town tales, retired from somewhere, a craftsman of claws and whistles and impossible stories. He had been seen feeding a red fox outside his kitchen door years ago, then a pair of cubs the next winter. The whispers hardened into a half-remembered scandal about a woman who'd visited. Sometimes they'd murmured about odd noises in the night, about a blue jacket that Calder always wore. Then Calder stopped appearing in their conversations altogether. The house fell into disrepair and the lane grew quieter. Rosa's hands shook when she spoke the old name. He loved them, she said. He loved them like children. Some folks didn't like it, but he loved them. The team started to map the lane by instinct. Ember's window faced it directly. The patch of earth she dug at daily sat under the maples outside the clinic, where a crumbled brick had been pushed aside. Ember's paws flung dirt with a purpose so focused it felt like a memory at work rather than a behavior learned in the clinic. Sometimes she unearthed nothing. Other times there were fragments. A rusted button, a sliver of cloth the color of old denim, a bead of glass that had once been blue. The items were small and ordinary, but to Ember they were anchors, and she treated them with rituals of sniff and paw, assessment, and then a soft, disappointed retreat. Without funding, their clinic would hollow out. The inspector's deadline sat like an iceberg against the hull of their compassion. Maya petitioned for an extension, arguing that Ember's failure to release was a behavioral issue that required investigation. Paper met paper, policy met plea. The county's wildlife coordinator said they could extend if they could justify it with evidence. Reasons must be documented, alternatives proposed. So Maya began to document. Charts of Ember's pacing, video of her window stare, logs of every time she dug until her paws bled with effort. The footage looked almost religiously faithful. Ember at the glass, Ember at the jacket, Ember at the dirt. The clips lived on a thumb drive labeled in Maya's tidy handwriting. Ember obsession 1 at night. After the clinic emptied, Maya walked the lane. It was mostly abandoned storefronts and a florist that still sold gladiolus in the fall. The stone house that housed Calder had a fence with slats held together by wire and a gate that groaned on its hinges. Ember would press her face to the window and cry as if she could hear something only she could hear. One Thursday, when the rain smeared the street to glass, Maya took the jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. The scent of soaked fabric made a faint, almost forgotten memory bloom at the back of her throat. A campfire, old smoke, the tang of iron and leaf mold. Ember's eyes became glass pinpoints, transfixed, as if the jacket itself carried a talon of recall. The neighbors' stories had holes. There was no formal record that Calder had ever been investigated or arrested. There was no obituary. There was only a scrap of a newspaper clipping Rosa kept folded in a recipe book. A picture of a younger Calder with a fox in his arms and a line that read, "Local man cares for urban wildlife." The photograph had been taken decades ago. The fox looked content like a child with a parent. The blue jacket in the photograph, though faded and bleached by time, was unmistakable. Ember, looking at that photograph for the first time, did not sniff. She did not paw. She simply lay down at Maya's feet and breathed slow, as if she recognized the angle of someone's smile frozen in grainy paper. The breakthrough was an accident of persistence. Jonah, clearing the clinic's back lot to make room for a temporary pen, tripped over a board that sounded hollow. He pried it up and found a small cavity beneath the earth, old, dry, lined with leaves. Inside lay a metal tin wrapped in oilcloth. Jonah handed it to Maya with mud-streaked fingers like it was both a relay baton and a confession. They opened the tin together. Inside was a child's whistle carved of bone, a broken button the exact blue of the jacket, and a photograph too small and too intimate to be anything but a portrait. A woman with copper hair holding a tiny fox against her chest, the blue jacket draped over her shoulders. Maya's heartbeat climbed like someone climbing stairs, mostly for the view. The woman in the photograph had eyes that looked like a map to somewhere unseen. There was a name scrawled on the back in a hurried hand, E. Hart. The handwriting looked familiar. Maya had seen those looping letters in the margins of old town records, the sort of shorthand an archivist would make. The tin felt like an invitation or a dare. Ember snarled, soft, testy, not vicious, at the tin the way an heirloom might snap at being moved from its place. Then she went to the window and sat very still, as if listening along the lane for an answer that might come back. They had a lead now, fragile as the thread in the photograph. A name, a jacket, a tin buried like a promise under their feet. The bureaucratic clock still ticked toward the county's deadline, but the team's rhythm had shifted. They were no longer obligations governed by forms. They were seekers. Each step they took toward the old stone house and toward Ehart's past felt like loosening a knot in a long, hidden rope. That night, as thunder rolled the lane into a soft, distant drum, Ember crawled into Maya's lap and slept with one ear half tilted to the window. Outside, the boarded house exhaled the small sounds of old things settling. Maya thumbed the back of the photograph and traced the hurried letters until the ink smudged. Something in the smudge looked like a map marker, a place they had to go. The team would need more than curiosity to pry the shelter open. They would need permission, courage, perhaps a bit of grace. They had 12 weeks, and the clock had suddenly become something else, less a deadline and more a countdown to discovery. They did not yet know whether discovery would bring solace or rupture, whether Ember's insistence would reveal kinship or simply a story renewed, but the cub's small, urgent behaviors had done what animals so often do. They refused to be categorized and instead invited humans to follow at dawn. Maya taped a copy of the photograph to the clinic door and beneath it wrote a single plea: help us find Ehart. If anything in this town moved the air, it moved in the morning, and with that first light a neighbor knocked, a voice from the other side of gossip ready to lend a detail or three that might finally fit the missing pieces. Ember opened her eyes, bright and hungry, and for a moment, as if sensing the shift like a current in the ground, she rose and trotted to the crate. She stood on her hind legs, placed her front paws on the windowsill, and looked out down the lane as if pointing not just to a house, but to a history that had been waiting for someone at last to ask the right question. Maya doesn't let herself feel relief all at once. It arrives in small increments, like the way Ember's heartbeat slows when someone finally cups her tiny body. Arthur watches from the doorway, eyes slippery with something between recognition and confusion. He reaches for a faded blue jacket hung over a chair and runs trembling fingers over a photograph pinned to the wall. The photograph is of a younger Arthur, arms wrapped around a dozen fox cubs, everyone smiling like a family portrait. The sight of it makes Maya's throat tighten. For a long suspended moment the house is nothing but those sounds, the rasp of breath, the tick of a clock, Ember's soft whimper, and then Arthur coughs out a sentence that drops like a pebble into a quiet pond. She always finds the ones who need us. Maya expects denial or panic. Instead, Arthur tells a story the way people tell confessions, slowly, as if testing each word to see if it will hold. He speaks of mornings that turned into nights without meaning, of notes left unread, of appointments missed and relatives who stopped calling, believing he had simply moved on. He says he remembered the names of every fox for years, remembered the way a newborn fit into the crook of his arm, but he kept forgetting appointments with his daughter, forgetting to answer the phone. Sometimes he would wake and not know where the day had gone. I thought if something small and real could come here, he says, someone would notice. Someone would come back. There is a dangerous tenderness in his voice, a shape of regret that is both helpless and intentional. Maya wants to think his judgment slipped, that dementia had made him careless. But then Arthur describes leaving Ember specifically in a patch of bracken near the trail. He remembers, with surprising clarity, tucking the cub into a bed of leaves and pressing a scrap of a blue jacket beside her so someone who knew him, someone familiar with his jacket, might follow the trail. He says he picked the path he used to walk into town, the one that led past the old bus stop, past the bakery where Maya's mother once worked. He had not wanted to be found that day. He had wanted to be seen. Maya's throat goes dry. The pieces she had filed away as a child, her grandmother's late-night arguments, the abrupt packing of suitcases, a silence that lasted years, shimmer into whole shapes. This man was not simply lost. He had been trying, in his imperfect way, to anchor himself back into the world. Ember, fragile and small, was the tether he pushed into the current. I thought if someone took care of her, they'd look beyond the cub, Arthur says. I thought they'd look for me outside. Word spreads with the quickness of a snapped twig. One neighbor stops, then another, drawn not by spectacle but by an old loyalty to the man who had once mended fences and taught children how to tell an owl from a hawk. Someone brings a thermos of tea, someone else brings a blanket. Maya watches the street become a living photograph, neighbors rearranging themselves into lines of concern. It is messy and loud and very human, apologies muttered like offerings, hands extended, eyes avoiding each other until they cannot. The first to speak is Arthur's daughter, a woman with her father's chin and a mother's wary steadiness. She steps forward as if expecting rejection. Instead, she folds into a hug that breaks both of them into open pieces. The reunion does not resolve neatly. Years of accumulation, missed recitals, birthdays gone uncalled, a house that emptied, can't be erased with a single embrace. Memories arrive like old mail, late and stiff, and they require the slow work of sorting. Yet Ember's presence reframes their ache. As the cub wakens to small human hands and familiar voices, something softens. Children who used to run past the cottage now linger, faces painted with curiosity instead of fear. A teenager brings a stack of printouts showing a map of local wildlife corridors. An elderly neighbor produces a handwritten ledger of the foxes Arthur had helped years before, names immortalized in pen and ink. Conversations that had once stopped at distance begin to cross thresholds. Maya finds herself in the middle of it, the connector she never planned to be. She holds Ember as Arthur looks on, and in that look there is a mix of gratitude and something like apology offered without the words. The sanctuary they build that day is not yet a physical place but a promise. To check in, to carry groceries, to make sure no one in their little radius slips away again. Word travels farther than the neighborhood. Someone takes a photograph, a single, grainy image of Ember curled in Maya's hands, Arthur's blue jacket draped over a chair behind them, Arthur's daughter kneeling at the doorway. The photograph is honest and small, and it lands like a seed. Within 48 hours, the photo is online. It spreads through feeds and hearts. Local news picks it up, then a conservation blogger, then a national outlet with a morning show segment. People cry in comment threads. A woman who runs a wildlife rehab center in another state emails to say she has a spare incubator. A group of teenagers donates a set of heat pads someone once used for their newborn kittens. Money trickles, then floods. A modest GoFundMe becomes a thread of donations, doubling and redoubling. Offers of help arrive from strangers who had once been strangers to the town but now carry the image of a small fox cub in their heads. The story is simple and shattering: a lost man, a found cub, a family fractured and mending. Viewers write about their own grandparents, about gaps they have tolerated for too long, and about the small, practical ways they will now reach out. Fundraising leads to concrete plans. A local community center offers a room while the town applies for a small grant to build an actual sanctuary space. Wildlife rehabilitators volunteer to teach classes, and veterinarians offer discounted care. Arthur, sitting in a chair that faces a stack of photographs and notes, begins a regimen of supervised visits. He is assessed, taught memory exercises, and given care that balances dignity and safety. His daughter is present, but not in the way of a babysitter. She is learning to be a daughter again, negotiating forgiveness and boundaries. Sometimes Arthur sleeps through the morning, and sometimes he remembers a fox's name with startling clarity. The family learns to honor both kinds of mornings. Ember grows under the glow of the town's attention, but she isn't merely a mascot. She is the axis of a change. The sanctuary takes shape not as a monument, but as a network. Neighbors trained in basic wildlife care, a roster of volunteers willing to drive animals to the nearest vet, a system for checking on vulnerable elders. The town rediscovers its muscle of looking out for one another. Children who had been glued to screens now make paper schedules of who will check on Arthur each day. Teenagers repaint a mural of a fox running through a stylized landscape. The mural is imperfect and luminous, a tangle of bright paint over cracked plaster, and when it is finished, the town holds a small, damp ribbon cutting with hot chocolate and applause. There are complications. Some argue that Arthur should have been in a facility, that the ethics of his plan were fraught. Legal forms must be signed, professionals must be convinced that leaving Ember where she might be found was not negligence but a desperate, flawed attempt to reconnect. The debate is aired in town meetings and letter columns, and thorny care plans are drafted that balance Arthur's autonomy with his safety. But those debates occur within a context already altered by what Ember brought to light. A deeper commitment to do better. For Maya, the change is personal. She takes up a role coordinating volunteers and keeping loose ends tied. She is still angry sometimes, angry at the years without her grandfather, angry at the family that walked away without shoes. But anger becomes a tool. It sharpens her focus. As Ember gets stronger, as the sanctuary secures a formal home with a small clinic and a fenced rehabilitation area, Maya watches how one fragile creature's arrival rewrote the priorities of a place. Where there had been silence, now there are schedules and laughter and the steady sound of people checking in on each other. The final twist comes quietly, 3 months after the initial find. A packet arrives in the mail for Arthur, a letter from a neighbor who had moved away decades before. Inside is a photograph of a young Arthur holding a fox cub, and on the back, in a hand that has wavered with age, 3 words, "You taught us." The note explains that years ago Arthur had inspired a whole generation to care for wildlife. They had become fosterers and biologists and policymakers because someone had taught them to see small lives as worthy. Ember had not only pulled a family back together, she had tugged at a lineage of care Arthur had once set in motion. One that had paused but never died. Maya stands at the window watching Ember tumble in the grass, sunlight threading through her fur. Arthur is asleep in his chair, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. The town is quieter now, but steadier. The sanctuary has rules and volunteers, and most important, a culture of looking up from one's own life long enough to notice the fragile things around you. Maya realizes the strangest truth. In setting out to rescue a cub, they rescued a story, the story of a man who had tried to pull his life back into the world in the only way he could imagine. Ember becomes more than a fox. She is the hinge that opened 100 doors, the small body that reconnected hands and mended patterns. And in the long, slow light of that understanding, Maya finally forgives the years of silence, not because forgetting can be excused, but because the work of repair had begun. Sometimes, she thinks, the rescued are the ones who save us.